Welcome to the inaugural episode of Local and Uncommon. Today's conversation is an incredible glimpse into the history of Kiawah Island like you've never heard before. My two guests, Frank Brumley and Mark Permar, were instrumental in the early 1970s at the very beginning of Kiawah's development, and they have some amazing stories to share. This is one you don't want to miss. I'm Robert Vingi, and this is Local and Uncommon. Frank Brumley and Mark Permar both began a lifelong association with Kiawah in the early 1970s. Frank, you once said, "I not only know where the skeletons are buried on Kiawah, I know where the shovels are." I know you were born and raised in the Sea Islands of Georgia, and your family dates back in Florida as early as 1902. So it goes without saying you have deep roots in the tropical South. Frank, tell us how you first found yourself and your young family driving down Bohicket Road towards Kiawah Island in the early 1970s.
Sure, Robert. It actually starts a little earlier than that for some background. I grew up in a little town, St. Mary's, Georgia, which is Santa Maria behind St. Augustine, second oldest town in the United States. And so my father was in the paper industry, and we had a beautiful island offshore, the last island in the Golden Isles, which was Cumberland Island. And Charles Frazier, the founder and early developer of sea pines, Hilton Head, walked into the St. Mary's State Bank where I was employed by my father one day in 1969 and said, "Frank, I've acquired 3,000 acres on Cumberland Island, and would you have any interest in coming to work for me? And we're going to develop it. We're going to turn Cumberland Island into another Hilton Head." And I said, "Well, that'll be interesting, Charles. I think you might have a difficult time, but I'd like to learn more." So he offered me a job, and I turned it down, basically saying I had a situation that was set and in hand with family, and really wasn't interested. But he was persistent and offered me a consulting relationship, which I did, and joined the Sea Pines Company. And within 6 months, the hook was set, and Charles had me working for the Sea Pines Company, and we were embarked on a one-year effort to start the development of Cumberland Island. It was not meant to be, and we all quickly figured that out. And Charles sent me and an attorney from Augusta, Georgia, to Washington to sell the 3,000 acres on Cumberland that he'd bought to the National Park Service and for a National Seashore Park. And we sold that property and took the money that we were paid by the federal government, and they eventually acquired the rest of Cumberland and turned it into a perfectly beautiful National Seashore Park. It was one of those properties that never should have been developed, and so it was Charles thought we could get a bridge and a road there like was done at Jekyll Island, Georgia, but that it was not to be. The Carnegie family owned the north end, the Coca-Cola family, and they basically were not behind it. They got the Mellon family behind them, and they stopped any potential development. And the rest is history. It became wonderful, as it should be, a National Seashore Park. Well, we took the money from the sale of Cumberland and bought Amelia Island Plantation. I actually bought the south end of Amelia Island, Florida, just south of Fernandina Beach, 3,000 acres, 6 miles of beachfront. And I moved my wife, Blanche, and our 3 little girls to Fernandina Beach, Florida, and embarked on a development of Amelia Island Plantation. And so that was my introduction. This was 1969. This was my introduction to island development, and embraced it. We were at Amelia. I was the original vice president, general manager of Amelia Island Plantation for 4 years. And Charles called one day and said, "The Kuwait Investment Company has purchased Kiawah." This was in 1974, and would you and Blanche and your family be interested in moving to Charleston to head up the development team that we're going to do it on a contractual basis for the Kuwait Investment Company. So we said yes. We had visited Charleston. We had 3 little girls, 6, 8, and 10 at the time. We were in a position to move. I was enthralled with the Sea Pines Company. What I thought I was going to be doing, developing Cumberland, had gone away. So to find a chance to wet my teeth at Amelia and then go to Charleston, which is one of our favorite places in the world to visit, just made a lot of sense. So we said yes, we would make the move. And so one day Charles called and said, well, it's available, Frank. I've got a key to the gate, and you and Blanche need to drive to Charleston, spend the weekend, get to know the city, and go out and take a look at the island. So we embarked upon that trip, a memorable one for our lives, and we did. We drove up to the locked gate across a ramshackle wooden bridge.
It was just a cattle gate?
It actually was. There was a cattle gate because there were some cows and horses on the island, so there were actual cattle gate, a framed metal gate that the cows couldn't walk across.
And I assume the road up to the bridge was dirt.
It was all dirt. We came in through the Andale property. There was a dirt road that came off Seabrook had been under development for a number of years, and basically it moved slowly. And so it was not really competition, but it was some infrastructure out in that direction. The road was paved at least to the point of where Freshfields is now. So we drove the dirt road through the Andale fields to the gate, had our key, unlocked it, and as we were crossing across the wooden bridge on our way to onto the Kiawah Island, an oncoming car approached us, and it was turned out we had no idea who it was or who it was going to turn out to be, but it was Ms. Eugenia May Royal, who is the widow of the owner of the island, and
C.C. Royal's wife.
C.C. Royal's wife, and it had just been purchased and been announced, and a lot of tumult within the family. It was upside down. There were 3 daughters and 2 sons. And they basically all had their own agendas for how they had wished to be involved in the island, the development of the island. So they were not happy about it. So we got a real glare, Blanche and I did, from Ms. Royal as she drove across the bridge wondering who we were.
Oh, my goodness. Did she stop and speak, or did y'all just pass?
We sat there terrified, and she drove with a mean stare across the bridge as we were
That's
sitting.
your first introduction to Kiawah.
First introduction to Kiawah, absolutely was. And it was a great one and a memorable one. We went on the island and met, actually we're on our way there to meet Joe Frazier, Charles Frazier's brother. There was some entertainment going on on Eugenia Avenue at this settlement that CC had started with a group of Charleston doctors and real estate people. Max Hill was one of them, and then the group of politicians from Columbia, including the Governor John West. They were having a barbecue at their Front Beach house on Eugenia, so we went there for our introduction to the island, which we thoroughly enjoyed. Met a lot of nice people. Met a lot of long-term, lifelong friends that were property owners, and it was with somewhat of a funny look that we got even from those people. They were welcoming, much more so than Ms. Royal, but they candidly, I don't think, were really pleased to see the new developers of the island come on. They had enjoyed a 5,000-acre private national park for a long time. Nobody on the beaches, 15, 16 houses, and we knew a number of the property owners. Turned out my daughter married into one of the families who built one of the original houses on the island. Dr. Dan Ellis had he and the Sosnowskis had the northernmost properties on the island side by side. And so we had that introduction, and it turned out, 28 years later, our daughter married their son.
Oh, my goodness.
And we shared 3 grandchildren together. So that was the early introduction, and it kind of began from there. Charles did say, Frank, we'll eventually get to a house for you on Kiawah, but really want you to live downtown and get to know the people, get to know the politics. Mayor Joe Riley had just been elected, and you need to get to know your way around. We've got to rezone this island. It's zoned agriculture, and we're going to have planned unit development. And it's going to go through Charleston County. It's going to be tumultuous, to say the least, and so that's going to be an interesting couple of years for us. So make sure while you're in town this weekend, go into town and look for, see if you can find a house. So we ended up on the peninsula, and it's interesting. We were introduced this afternoon to the crew here. So this tell the rest of the story and don't blow it the introduction. We were riding around Charleston looking for a nice neighborhood, and we saw some beautiful homes on the peninsula in the historic area. And so I rode down Broad Street and found a realtor, the Reed Company, and went in, and guy behind the desk said, well, where do you think you want to be in Charleston? And I said, well, we found a beautiful group of houses over on Laguerre Street. And he said, well, Mr. Brumley, the first thing we got to teach you how to do is how to pronounce Lagree. He said, it's not Laguerre, it's Lagree, it's French Huguenot, and you probably won't be able to afford to live on Lagree Street, but you'll find something in the neighborhood. So that was our first introduction, and my first correction by a Charlestonian as to the
first of many
corrections. And we ended up on Trad Street, and actually met a wonderful lady named Betty Hanahan, who was the realtor of esteem in Charleston, and she took me under her wing and found us a house. And in fact, it was interesting. The house we rented for a year at 107 Lagree Street was being built by General Westmoreland, and he was running for governor, and was trying to think positive, and had taken a house in Columbia. So he rented us his house on Lagree Street that he and his wife had just finished, and so we rented that house. And as you can imagine, with his military background, he had a lot of important friends, which they paraded by the house frequently. They kept the pool house in the rear of the house we were living in on the front of the property at 107 Trad, so the Westmorelands were there a lot. He was not successful in his effort for governor. He was beaten by Republican Jim Edwards, and so he was not successful. So he wanted his house back before my year was up. But we got to know the Westmorelands well. But he had friends like Bob Hope, who he'd met through the military entertainment business in Vietnam, and they were there frequently. And Bob Hope would come by and rap on the window and put his nose against the window and say, "The general wants you to leave." And we would acknowledge that, and quickly found a house on Church Street, 90 Church Street, which is a gorgeous place, and we lived there for several years, and then bought a succession of houses over on Trad Street, where we lived for the next 40 years in Charleston.
Now, you mentioned the Governors. It makes me wonder, does Governor's Drive on Kiawah, was that named from
it was, absolutely.
Governor West? Over
the years, historically, it goes back even further than that. The Vanderhorst, some pronounce locally in Charleston as Vanderhorst, but the correct pronunciation is Vanderhorst, and a prior former governor of the state. So I think the governor probably, even though there was a succession, including John West from Camden, who had his place there on the island. That was known as the Club, and it was Earl. What was his last name? You introduced him. It was the lieutenant governor or secretary of state. They had the house together. He and West owned the house together. And,
Earl Morris.
Earl Morris, excuse me.
Yeah.
It was Earl Morris and John West owned that house together, And it was a really interesting group of important people and very nice people that owned those first 17 houses. And Eugenia was dirt road, never had been paved, and they didn't want it paved. And Still don't, exactly. So we rented a house on Eugenia for the summer, and Blanche and I moved to Charleston in April of 1974 and rented the house downtown. I rented 67 Broad Street, which turns out I bought 40 years later, and my current office is there now, and the family owns that piece of property, but it had been restored by Robert Hollings, Fritz Hollings' brother, a beautiful 1754 building. We leased that first floor for the Kiawah Island company offices, and Blanche and I were a block away with our three little girls at 90 Church Street. So that was our introduction in our first year. And it was Charles he'd gone through this at Hilton Head for the years. We had an excellent relationship. We'd both gone to the University of Georgia. Charles had gone on to Yale Law School, but we both had grown up in small town Georgia backgrounds. He in Hinesville near Savannah, and me in this little town of St. Mary's. And so we had an early affinity and a relationship and friendship for the next 35 years until Charles and Joe both passed away. But Charles knew living on an island, difficult, getting started, having your kids commute to school. So he said, live downtown and get started. And so with the planning process, we decided to build, so we built 5 houses on the oceanfront and 5 on Second Row on Eugenia that we, we had company architects design those houses, and we sold them to kind of selected people. We kept one, which was the Kuwait Beach House, where they stayed when they came. And then Blanche and I had a house on Eugenia where we lived with our 3 little girls. And for the 4 years that I was responsible for managing the Kiawah Island company. So we had a house there on weekends, but continued to live downtown. The girls were at Ashley Hall at school, and it was important to live downtown. And Charles really wanted me connected. He knew how important that was. He had established a similar relationship with Savannah while he was starting Hilton Head. So he was smart that was something that we should do, and we did.
Well, your comments just raised so many more questions in my mind. But before I jump to those, I want to introduce my second guest, Mark Permar, who's a noted planner and architect. And Mark, you also are early in this story. Tell me how you and your wife Diana came to meet Frank and your original affiliation with Kiawah.
Well, I'll try to keep up with Frank. I mean, this is an amazing, I can listen forever to your storytelling, Frank, but my wife and I came at it from a slightly different direction, but the common ground is sea pines. So my wife and I were living in Washington, D.C. In the early 70s, and we decided to move to Savannah in 1973 for a job opportunity I had with a firm known as Corcoran Wiggins, Lee & Lominack. They were largely based on Hilton Head, did an enormous amount of work for sea pines in their various locations, but they also had an office in Savannah and were seeking expansion of additional architects. So I had friends that were based on Hilton Head, but we had an affinity for living downtown because we lived in Old Town Alexandria, and it was a natural to sort of shift to Savannah. And within, I would say, about 45 days of living in Savannah, we thought we had made the worst decision in our young life. And it was largely around work opportunity for my wife, Diana. She had just left a job in Washington, D.C., where she was growing her career in research, market research, and discovered that Savannah was a slightly different market opportunity for young professional women in terms of job opportunities in the 70s. So it was challenging. And she worked in different locations. She worked for an insurance company at the time. That was the insurance company, Carswell, if you remember, Frank. It was the insurance company for Sea Pines, or at least one of them. And she was introduced to someone at Sea Pines, which then led to her being hired by the Sea Pines company in '73 to be a part of the market research team for their many communities, several of which that Frank mentioned. She was involved in multiple locations, but it eventually evolved into being part of the original team that Frank was putting together with the Sea Pines group to be involved with Kiawah. And she would come home from her day visits to Sea Pines talking about this place known as Kiawah, went with the team up to Kiawah to see it for the first time, came back glowing about the nature of what this place was. And she was not prone to hyperbole, but she was definitely prone to describing an incredible day for her first day at Kiawah. I was still doing what I wanted to do in Savannah, so we had the classic young family challenge of split, thoughts, because Frank and his team, as he outlined, were invited to go move up to the Charleston, Kiawah area, and Diana was part of the team that was being asked to move up there. I was the resistant party. I hadn't seen Kiawah yet. But I joined with her on a trip up to a planning retreat that Frank had organized in one of the homes that you mentioned, Frank, on Eugenia Avenue with his team. And Diana said, why don't you just come up with me while I'm involved with this planning retreat? You can go out, and if you want to drive into Charleston, but you can see what Kiawah is all about. So I tagged along, sort of the semi-resistant husband, and they gave me the key. I hadn't seen the beach yet. I took the same sort of journey that Frank took, which is driving through Johns Island, which was largely a very active agrarian area. In fact, I think we drove through it, Frank, when tomato season was going on, and Bohicket Road was flush with tractors and trailers of enormous amount of activity. It says, and these incredible oaks that you would drive down Bohicket. It was sort of a compelling visual story of energy. We finally made it to Kiawah. As I said, I hadn't seen the beach yet. They gave me the keys to an old Jeep. Had no top to it. Now, this is before Jeeps were a thing. And said, while we're meeting, you can just drive around on these old logging roads, old dirt roads, and see the island that way. If you get lost, because it was a beautiful day, just listen for the ocean and follow the sound to the ocean, and then you can drive back to the house they were meeting at on the beach. On the beach. And I thought that was sort of interesting. For a Midwesterner, that was sort of an interesting idea. But so I'm driving around for at least an hour and a half and bumping into various ponds and marshlands and overlooks. But it was largely a dense maritime forest. And I was doing this combination of, well, this is impressive, but, what's the big deal? I'm not exaggerating here. I bump into Canvasback Pond and you get to the edge only to discover an enormous number of alligators that were sort of headed in your way. And it was sort of adventuresome, but I did get lost, and I got lost down in what was known as Cougar Island, which is now Ocean Park. And there was an old road called Ghost Crab Road that took you directly to the beach. And I found that road. I listened for the beach, the ocean, like I was suggested. And I'm going to get emotional. I'll never forget driving out on that beach.
When you emerged from the maritime forest onto the
dense
beach.
maritime forest, out on this beach. I mean, it captured me.
Yeah. Amazing. And it still does today.
And it's not over. So I turned the keys off, and I just was in awe because you would not see one structure at the east end of the beach. It was endless. And it was a beautiful day with very few clouds. And I hear this rumbling like thunder, but there was no evidence of thunder in the sky. And out of the maritime forest comes this modest herd of wild horses, which were really domesticated horses that were left roaming, right, Frank, in terms of run out on the beach, sort of like a Disney film, bounced around in the waves, and then slowly came up to me.
They're literally frolicking in the waves.
Oh, yeah. Slowly came up to me like, what is this? I couldn't believe it. Well, they were used to getting apples from people that would go out there. So I could hardly wait to drive back and find Diana and say, I am ready for the move to Savannah, which we ended up moving in the first quarter of 1979 with our only child, who was 2 at the time. And we found ourselves, I was the player, in sports terms, I was the player to be named later, because Diana was the lead. Charles Frazier loved research, right, Frank?
Absolutely, numbers guy.
He just loved research, and Diana loved research. And so she played, I would say, a pretty important role in terms of the team effort to identify market opportunity, both regionally as well as nationally. And we found ourselves moving to Kiawah, living we moved into Oceanwood Homes, which at the time was like the Ellis Island of Kiawah. So if you're a new employee, you would rent, one of the cottages that the company built at Oceanwood Homes as a base camp. So there's a small group of us, all employees, salespeople, managers, and we're all relatively the same age, had children roughly the same age. We were by ourselves, but there were enough people to form a community. It was romantic from the standpoint of you'd have beach parties, you would share shopping lists to go in town, you would, the stuff of existence of a handful of people there. And we originally came to Kiawah with the intent of living there 3, maybe 5 years, and then moved back to cities, and because that was our true love, living in a city. And go figure, we still live there. Now we vacation in cities.
That's incredible.
So let me just stop there.
No, we're not going to let you stop, Mark. We want to hear a lot more. So continuing that for a moment, Mark, as you said, you still live on Kiawah today. How do you compare the current state of the island? Are you pleased with how it's unfolded, or are there any big do-overs, or what? Tell us kind of how you think about it because I can only imagine you and Diana driving around every day and experiencing it and comparing it to your first experiences on the island.
Wow, that's a loaded question. Let me answer it this way, and I'll simmer on part of it while I'm answering. The early years were pioneering years, as Frank pointed out. Not only did you have a young family, but you had, for us, it was a young career. And our career path, whether it was research or planning and design, ultimately it was about creating community. The Kiawah Island Company was not just a development company, it was a community development company. And that's a difference. There's a big difference. And Frank's work with his team was, yes, there were business challenges and the idea of the classic evolution of a vision. He mentioned the process of entitlements. Imagine in 1974, foreign ownership of American soil in the Southeast, and not just foreign ownership from the Middle East, at the height of the first oil embargo, with inflation in the mid-teens, cost of borrowing money. the challenges were enormous, Frank. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like today with similar challenges. But the team led by Frank went through the entitlement process with then the unincorporated part of Charleston County. Now Kiawah is an incorporated town of Kiawah Island, but at that time it was the unincorporated part of Charleston County. Probably not all that familiar, right, Frank, with large-scale development. Seabrook might have been the largest scale of development, and it was modest. Right, at the time.
Good description.
But this was large scale. I mean, the original entitlements envisioned through the planned unit development as many as 7,000 total units, an unlimited number of hotel rooms,
right.
400 to 600,000 square feet of retail.
Several golf courses.
I mean, it was an enormous resort-oriented business plan. Would you agree in terms of that?
10 miles of beachfront.
10 miles of beachfront.
So a lot of that, interestingly, hasn't come to pass, which I know is by design. It's been very thoughtfully curated and developed. Tell us how that shift occurred from the more dense initial approvals, Frank, and Mark, to the more sedate and graceful execution that we see and enjoy today.
Frank, maybe you could outline the initial idea of the 3 resort villages at the time, a fair number of hotel rooms. Maybe you could outline that, and then maybe I could add to the transition.
Yeah, when we built the original hotel, there were things that we kind of cobbled together. Charles we had these various developments going on at Amelia and Hilton Head, and had pieces of the puzzle. So actually, the original inn, the Kiawah Island Inn we built, was a motel lifted from Hilton Head, from Sea Pines. The center section was the tennis center from Amelia Island. So we took that complex that had a Jasmine porch restaurant and kind of stuck it in the middle. It was cobbled together, and thank the Lord there were a lot of trees that hid a lot of the architecture that really wasn't that terribly good. But put that together, and Charles had this concept at the time from a planning standpoint. He likened it to a wagon wheel and spoke, and we were gonna take the car away from the American tourist or vacationer, and the idea was we'd put the inn in the middle. We'd have this wagon wheel, and around the perimeter of the wheel, we'd have golf and tennis and dining, and in the center there would be the hotel with its inn complex. And that was kind of the way things were first. And we'd have scattered housing all within walking distance. That was kind of the idea. Well, it turned out for too long that we discovered that the American did not want to be separated from his automobile. He wanted to be able to go back and get things out of the car. They had to have parking nearby. So that was one of those early concepts that Charles had that seemed like a good idea.
If I remember correctly, the acronym was CRDU, Critical Resort Development Unit, based upon the experience of Sea Pines and other locations, that the wagon wheel was a 5-minute walk distance from the center. And why 5 minutes? That's about as far as Americans will walk before they have to be in a car. But the idea was you sized all the residential, the food and beverage, the recreation, all within that 5-minute walk, so that you could stay wherever you were staying, whether you were staying in the inn or a rental unit. It was like a base camp. So everyone would scatter during the day, reconvene, scatter, or if it was group business, everything was in walk distance, right, Frank? I mean, it was...
We were going to do that, and we were going to do several of those pods up the island. We had the original one was the one we opened with a hotel in 1976, and then there was going to be the East Beach Village in the center with a lot of meeting facilities, and then we were going to do the river village back at Kiawah Bluff, Rhett's Bluff, was going to be the third major, and we really at that point hadn't really even ventured about eventually the northern, the Dye Golf Course, and those properties were somewhere in the back of Charles, the gleam of his eye, but we really hadn't gotten beyond those first three kind of village concepts. But we embarked on that and opened the hotel in 76, and including the funny story about the first golf course. People think about Nicholas, and Nicholas was really the second golf course. First golf course was Gary Player, and so we. This is really ridiculous how things get started, and most of this background isn't known, but some people will figure out now who play golf out there. Charles nor I were golfers. Neither one of us played golf at all. Never had, and never would. And we came up with this idea, Charles in particular, because he was a student of everything. And he said, well, what we really need, Frank, is a short golf course, maybe a par 64 that somebody can play in 3 hours. And we'll get Gary Player to do that. He's not a purist. He'll do whatever we pay him to do, and we're going to come up with, and we're going to build this par 64 golf course, and about 4,000, maybe 4,500 yards, and then we'll be able to have all these business meetings in the inn, and the businessmen will come. They'll play golf in the morning for 3 hours. They'll be back, have lunch, and then they have their afternoon business meetings, and that's going to be the business kind of format for the original Kiawah Island Inn Village, and that made sense. Well, Charles and I, being night golfers, thought that made a great idea. Player, nice guy, didn't care. As long as we were writing him his monthly checks, he designed what we wanted him to. So we had it under construction, and was early stages of being built. And the people at Hilton Head, who were all golfers, figured it out, and he came up and said, what in the hell are you guys doing? No self-respecting golfer is going to come to Kiawah and go back home, and they say, what did you shoot? No, well, I shot a 69, and I shot a 71. And they said, well, hell, you're a 20 handicap. How can that be possible? Well, we were playing on a short, consolidated course, and the resident golfers who knew what the hell they were doing, and the guys like Pat McKinney who had to sell the property and selling it to golfers, and said, this is nuts, stop this right now. So
I heard Pat say, I'm not coming up here to head up sales if you're going to do that with golf. That's what I heard.
You're going to do. He did say that. And Hal Ravenel was an active golfer. Hal had come to work for us here and was running part of the sales team. And they said, this is just stupid, Frank. It ain't going to work. Well, Charles and I couldn't argue. We didn't have any idea what we were trying to do, but nobody told us for the first 6 months. So we had the course designed and under construction that we were way off base.
So you had to find 3 more holes.
Had to extend the course by about 1,500 yards and find 3 more holes. And so to this date, I have people. Well, the first year till we started the Nicholas course, which was the second course, we had people say, I was playing that first hole at Cougar, the first couple of holes, and it had the strangest sequence of lagoons and landing areas, and it didn't make any damn sense. And so Charles and I would laughingly tell them the story, blame it all on ourselves, and say, how it turned out that way. And so we extended it from 4,600 to 6,400. It was still a short course. We were limited in what we could do with it, but did a pretty good job with it.
Great little course.
It's a lot of people really like it, and it was named the original course was a Cougar course because it had been long-term stories, and I still read about them today. And I just was looking at the last copy of Legends magazine and saw one of the caddies says that he's seen a cougar on the island. But Dr. Dan Ellis, my daughter's grandfather-in-law, lived in the island when there weren't but the 15 houses on the front beach. And he swears, and he was an outdoorsman. He knew the damn difference between a bobcat and a cougar. And he said, I saw this animal, long tail, and probably 100 pounds, and it wasn't a bobcat. And he was confident it was a cougar. Nobody had ever gotten pictures. I was out there for a long number of years. I never saw a cougar. But I've heard from enough people who are outdoorsmen and who I felt, named and would damn well knew the difference between the two. But that was the original process, and so we scrapped it, extended it, and then went on and to build and I worked with Nicholas in the first golf course design, and then left in '78. Kuwaitis and I did not get along. We had a difficult. It was interesting. It was the first generation of the Kuwait Investment Company, basically, that had come from their original heritage, and most of them. The story got explained to me. We met the chairman of the Kuwait Investment Company was a fellow named Abdul Latif Al Hamid, and he was in Harvard MBA and brilliant and one of the nicest people you'd ever seen. But he was one of the very few at the top that were candidly college educated in the early 70s. And it was explained to us that most of the Kuwaitis' fathers had been pearl divers and camel drivers, and so they didn't grow up at their father's knee seeing him read the Wall Street Journal and at home at night. They had really no idea about the American business perception and model and what was expected and what was anticipated. And I had formed the early company and brought in a lot of people and had pension programs and things that as part of the retirement that had all been approved. And I just got into a breakdown in communication with the Kuwait Investment Company. They called me one day and said, "You're going to have to cancel the retirement program." And I said, "Well, I can't do that." I said, "I've brought these people in, relocated engineers and architects from all around the country." And we had several hundred employees at Kiawah at that point. It was before you hired consultants, you built your own team. As Mark was remarking, we brought in people from Hilton Head, and we brought in people from all around the country. And I hired a whole team, most of whom are still in Charleston today in private practice, Miles Glick and people like that. They're local architects. So anyway, I got into cross purposes with the Kuwait Investment Company and left there in 1978. I never could for a long time figure out if I resigned or if I was fired, because it was a close match. It was one of those things that just didn't work out well, and so I left there in 1978. And for the next 10 years, I really had the Brumley company and was a partner at Wild Dunes in the development. Built 2 Fazio golf courses at Wild Dunes, and then came back in with the Beach Company group, and we bought the property back in 1988, and was a partner for the next 10 years, but kept my own company, and that's when I started the investigation and the later purchase of Daniel Island. So it was
wow, so much to unwrap here. One thing, while we're still on the golf and the idea that it could have been called Bobcat course instead of Cougar, and that it was only going to be 15 holes, but you also work with Jack Nicklaus. Tell us about what was that like working with Jack on Kiawah? What were his perceptions of Kiawah at that time? Was he excited, obviously, about what he saw the potential for? But tell us more about that experience.
Well, even a step before that, and this was interesting, while I was commuting back and forth from downtown, we had to get the planning underway. And so we fortunately had the Kuwait Investment Company money, and that was the interesting part of it. We used to laugh about being owned by the Arabs, and we'd get a lot of criticism from a lot of different people about the Arab ownership. So we had a lot of money in the 70s when nobody else did, and we acquired property, and we bought what's just a piece of land in the woods on Bohicket Road called Orange Hill. It was Orange Hill Plantation, and it's now in process with a new golf course being built there. And it was funny, but when we bought that property, we bought half a dozen double-wide trailers and moved them onto the Orange Hill property. And that was what we call the base camp. Mm-hmm. Mark will remember, we would meet there during the days, and that's where the teams of architects and land planners, and we all worked and basically planned Kiawah, and that's where we built the original Kiawah Island Inn, which we opened in 1976, was built from the planning that took place at Orange Hill Plantation in that trailer park camp that we did there. But it was a lot of fun. I can remember Rob Hull and the group of planners, that Fred Novak. We would get together and we'd say, all right, we got the first subdivision started on Kiawah, we've got to come up with 25 street names. So we'd say, all right, somebody bring a couple of cases of beer. And so the planning team and us and Mark and all the crowd had sent around and named the subdivision names basically after too many beers. But it all worked out pretty well. But that was the original team. We got to Kiawah, got things started, got the original golf course built, and then we started the selection process for the next golf course. And I was not a golfer, but I have to thank the Lord had Pat McKinney, who was a scratch golfer, and we had a lot of golf expertise from Hilton Head. It was available to us that would come. So we started doing interviews, and we interviewed Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer and Reese Jones. And I had I'd always been a part of Arnie's Army. I grew up in University of Georgia, going to Augusta to the Masters and following Arnold Palmer. And so I was just pre-focused on Palmer was going to design our next golf course. And so we had him up for interviews and in sequence over a 2 or 3 day period. Reese Jones was not nearly as well known as he is now, but was an interesting, and we knew he was a very good golf course architect. But I was just totally captured by Arnold Palmer and thought he should be our golf course designer. And so and I had used Pete Dye on the first golf course, 27 holes that we built in Amelia. So he was also there. But quick story about Dye. He, delightful fellow, he and his wife Alice, and they spent a lot of time at our home at Amelia with Blanche and I, because our initial home down there was the only place people could stay, and we had a guest house pool next door. So Pete and Alice would come and stay at the house. Pete would come over and read books to the children at night and things like that, the girls growing up. And it was interesting, but Dye never followed a set of plans. He just kind of walked around in the woods with some of this, and you never knew when you got your golf course finished how they were going to end up. Sometimes the fairways weren't where they're supposed to be. There weren't enough lots. I mean, he was crazy. And so I had decided when I left Amelia that I was never going to use him again, because he was a nightmare to work with and have a final master plan that ended up being something that you could build and develop and count on and get permits for. So Dye wasn't even considered up here until we came along for the Ryder Cup course, and that wasn't my decision. That was the current owners of the resort at the time. But so we interviewed Nicklaus and Jones and Palmer, and Arnold, I don't know, had a bad night the night before. He was flat as a pancake and didn't really impress anybody, including me, and I was prepared to be very impressed. Nicklaus swept us off our feet. He was like magic. And I thought he was a smart aleck, college kid, not long out of college, and I was not prepared. I'd seen him on television and wasn't prepared to be impressed by him. But he swept us off our feet. He was really a great salesman, did a great job with it. Reese Jones, I saw him in later years because we used him for our second course at Daniel Island, and he laughingly told the story. He said, I didn't even have enough money to fly to Charleston for the interview for the Kiawah course. He said I had to drive because my mother lived in North Carolina, and that's where I had a free place to spend the night. So I was driving down to spend the night at the Kiawah place so I could interview with you the next day. And I said, well, Reese, I hate to tell you this, I don't even remember the interview with you. I was so overwhelmed with Nicklaus and Dye and the great salesmen they were, and we ended up selecting Jack. And he did a great job, and he was an education for us, for me and for Pat and the planning team, because he had all these business formats. He had a signature course, and at one price for the design. He would come and spend a certain amount of time, and he would come and do interviews and play golf with people. And then you had a base price for a base course. Then he had his signature course, and so he was a salesman. But he did a great job. And then I left in late '78 when the Nicklaus course was actually under construction. So Mark and can kind of pick up. I was their way for the next 10 years.
So if I could pick up the
Please.
baton. So I hadn't been on, I joined in early 79 formally, and I hadn't been on the job but a week or so. And the center lines for the Turtle Point course, the Nicholas course, had been cut, and Nicholas was coming in to start to review the normal process. Mark, we need you to go out and verify the center lines of the, I'm on the job a week and I'm already 3 months behind in terms of the work, right? So I go out, and this was particularly critical for me because I grew up in Ohio. Nicholas was a boyhood idol for me. My dad would take me to Ohio State to watch he and Tom Weiskopf play for Ohio State. So that's where you cut the bug. And then, of course, the Firestone Country Club. I mean, Nicholas was a god in Ohio, so I could hardly wait, but nervous at the same time. And as you pointed out, he was so warm and human, and
Absolutely.
was a rarity for some golf course architects at the time, in which he would engage, but he would also listen. And so that first process of the the second 18-hole course was a big step forward. We shared with you through Frank's voice the opening of the original West Beach and the role it played in the DNA of the Sea Pines and so forth. Well, the Nicholas course was the earliest beginnings of what would become the second resort village, East Beach. Because if you know where it's located, it's on the peripheral of East Beach Village at that time. So it was the beginnings of that, and it played a critical role in the marketing to grow the market from a southeast market to the Midwest and Northeast with the second golf course, the Nicholas name. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was his 10th course. I can't imagine what the number is now, but it was still, he was still a significant player. So this was an important course for him too. And when he was asked out in the field about yet to be a third golf course, would you be interested in that too? Just as the where Osprey Point is now. He did a remarkable thing for golf course architects by not saying, I'd be absolutely interested in it. He said, you know what? You should have yet another name. Begin the process of Kiawah being a platform for multiple names of great architects. He said, I'd be happy to do that. But that's pretty interesting, isn't it? In terms of a professional like that. That transition from the beginnings of West Beach, that was the first awareness to the outside world of what Kiawah is.
That's right.
It had only been known by a handful of people, as Frank pointed out, in terms of who had essentially private access to the island. But now with West Beach, it's the beginnings of increased awareness through the greater market.
So now you've got East Beach and West Beach. You've got Gary Player, Jack Nicklaus golf courses under construction. Tell me about the kind of buyer. I mean, who was buying on Kiawah in the late 70s and early 80s? Where were they coming from? Tell us about those folks.
Well, it would be best answered by my wife, obviously, in terms of the market research. But I'd like to think that she would say at this point, or at least she would verify what I'm about to say, is it was a regional market at the beginning, right? It was familiar because of Hilton Head and the association with Sea Pines. There was already an awareness by the general market of the Sea Pines organization. Even though it was under the name of Kiawah Island Company, it was well known that Sea Pines was a large influence on this. So it borrowed heavily from the market that would be established to go to Hilton Head. But in this circumstance, it would be associated, the Hilton Head Savannah relationship. Now it was a Kiawah Charleston relationship,
right?
But along the southeast coast. So many of the buyers, I think she would say, drafted that in terms of the market. But because of the size and the scale of Kiawah going in the future, The regional market, there weren't enough people in the regional market to sustain the business plan that was proposed for the future villages and the future residential because of the scale of it. So there was a conscious effort to reach out to the more aggressively the Midwest, which was familiar with coming to the Southeast coast, and ultimately the Northeast, because if you look at the demographics in those areas, if you had at that earliest stage, you had to penetrate that, because at this time, Atlanta, Charlotte, Washington, D.C., now those are major markets for our part of the world. But at that time, would you agree, most of the people in Atlanta went to Georgia or the Florida Gulf Coast, whereas our patterns were mostly from the Midwest in the Northeast, but we needed to be more aggressive on reaching out to those people. So there was a really conscious effort to do that. One means for differentiating Kiawah from competitors was this attention to detail of the relationship to the natural environment of Kiawah. Kiawah is a powerful American landscape. The size of it is not obvious. If you lay a map of Kiawah on the peninsula of Charleston and put the eastern tip at the Battery, it would go beyond the airport to give you a sense of scale. It's a big American landscape. And so the appeal was, how do you communicate that from the standpoint of creating these sub-communities of the villages and then the residential areas? And early on, there was a decision because a lot of years these were large undeveloped areas for a lot of years, is expose people to that. And if I could borrow from my pile over here.
You've got a good collection.
So in that circumstance, there was a decision I think it's a remarkable marketing idea, is instead of relying upon just printed material or hoping to get people to come and stay for a long weekend or whatever, if they did, the marketing department introduced a Jeep safari to the undeveloped areas that you would normally not even have access to at all. And people still talk about that experience of, because you could drive a Jeep, you would follow other Jeeps. It was led by a biologist that would describe the environmental aspects of Kiawah, which was that environmental inventory that you commissioned, Frank, was significant in terms of generating a true understanding of the physical fabric. And people began to witness what could be a part of their experience going forward. No, it's not going to remain undeveloped forever, but you would have access to the entirety of Kiawah. So I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but that transition of sharing what are normal planning and development processes that you normally keep in the studio.
Right.
The idea was to share it with prospects and guests, and property owners then would share that. A big difference between the evolution of the physical plan of Kiawah from other like-kind resort communities is, because of the environmental assessment, a better understanding of designing with nature led to the real planning principles are the natural framework of which development occurs within. What is normal in the development world is you create where development is going to occur, and then residual property, the leftover property, is the natural setting. We did the opposite. We did a mapping of what was the natural framework, and then you led the team in your meetings out on Orange Hill and the other trailer parks that Little Rabbit Island was one of the,
right.
That's where I started, was Little Rabbit Island in a trailer. Yep. And he would have meetings in which he said, tell me what the site says. Frank and others would start with that. What is the site information, of which then you would start that.
Well, I think it's fascinating to hear this because Kiawah is an unequivocal success. It's a desired location for visitors around the world, certainly the United States, and it's because of these principles that the two of you were wise enough to seize on and execute. And Mark, in your case, it's remarkable that even today you are still influencing the aesthetic of Kiawah with your most recent work at Cougar Island. And while we're on this topic, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that stage of the development and how it's played out.
Well, first of all, you're very kind to say that, but it is it's the ultimate team project. So that I'm a stand-in for many professional women and men who are a part of creating places like Kiawah, much less. Let me borrow the one that you described, Ocean Park. That's the most recent example of development under the principles that were founded during the earliest years of designing with nature, that were carried forward by the now developer, the South Street Partners Group, but they elevated it to another level. You learn. You never stop learning. That's the key for professional teams. You never stop learning. Ocean Park was an example, and it's one of the very last pieces to be developed originally. Now we're in the world of redevelopment. But let me share with you a way of thinking that was applied there. First of all, we did the environmental assessment like we would always do in all the regions that we would go into. You had the macro environment analysis, and then you do the micro. You spend more time in the field than you do inside a building in a studio drawing. That's the difference. You do the flip of what a lot of designs are. But Ocean Park in particular was a result of some simple observations of never stopping to learn about how Kiawah has evolved. The majority of people that live on golf courses aren't golfers. They treat a golf course like a park. So they go out early in the morning before the golfers go through. Then they retreat. And then at the end of the day, depending upon the season, they do the same thing. So a simple observation of how people live on golf courses. They treat them like parks. Now, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here, and we can't share this with Diana, but I remember some research that Diana did where women come to places like Kiawah to connect, and men come to retreat. Now, I'm stretching it because not all men and women are exactly like that.
Of course.
But those are, in theory, competing interests for why you come to a place like Kiawah. But parkland is a way that you can do both. And then the third observation is people really like the romantic notion of living in nature until they start doing it, and then it's creepy and scary.
Lots of bugs.
It is. And you start carving things out. You start pulling away things from the house. And parkland is a way to meet each one of those three observations. So one thought process for Ocean Park was, well, maybe we could put a short course there. Maybe go back to the original thing, Frank, that you and Charles thought of. Maybe you were really onto something there. But the idea was, well, maybe it's something related to the ocean course. It's nearby. Now, the ocean course is a resort course, but maybe there's something related to golf there. But we evolved into understanding these simple observations because the perimeter of Ocean Park that overlooks the ocean course or this spectacular marshland, the values attributed to that are taken care of. Those are going to be valuable. The real challenge from a business perspective was how do you add value to the interior, which is the majority of Ocean Park. So the South Street Partners bought into the observations that we shared with you and said, well, why don't we wind a parkland through this area and enhance the value of property that isn't on the edge, on the perimeter? And the goal from a business perspective, and I want to share another business perspective that Frank took a lead on of how you transfer value. The goal from the perspective was to sell a park home site for as close to a golf home site as possible. If we could get to 80% of a golf home. Now people pay more for a park home site because they have access to it all day long.
Not just in the mornings and evenings.
And it's a place where you can both retreat, you can connect, you feel safer.
Wow.
You feel safe.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Safer, there's no golf balls crashing in.
Right. But the idea of transfer of value is a key one. I'll give you another great example that Frank's team initiated with the initial home sites along Surfsong Road. So those, other than Eugenia Avenue, that was the beginning of future residential home sites on the beachfront along Surfsong. And there was a decision by the team to actually set the home sites back further away from the primary dunes than you would normally have done. Now, this is before the state had setback lines and everything. This was a self-imposed decision. And if I'm not mistaken, Frank, that was not an easy decision because the VP of Finance said, let me understand this. We're taking home sites that could be closer to the beach. We're moving them further back, which means we're actually losing oceanfront home sites. I don't think that makes sense. But even though environmentally it made sense because it was a transition from dune vegetation to the maritime forest, that's what was the early indicator of where is the appropriate location to have oceanfront home sites. But the way it was sold to the VP of Finance from a business perspective is we're transferring the value of beachfront to non-oceanfront property. 90% of the property on Kiawah is not on the beach. So if you move the oceanfront further back, when I live on the marsh on the backside, when I go to the ocean, which I obviously don't go to very often because I'm not tan, but when I go to the ocean, I don't feel like I'm in someone's backyard.
Right.
My property, I'm willing to pay more for my property because when I do feel as though I go to the beach, I have greater value attributed to that. So when you look at the categories of non-oceanfront lots, they are higher, I would suggest, largely attributed to that decision by Frank and his team to set back further. Even though that was for environmental reasons, there was a business reason to do that too.
Fascinating.
And what we didn't expect is oceanfront property is more valuable. The expectation was oceanfront would be less valuable because you're further back. In fact, people on the oceanfront understood that, and they didn't feel like people were in their backyard. And by the way, the setback area is like an interstate for wildlife.
Right.
Bobcat, deer, everything. I mean, it's like so there's an example of solving multiple problems with singular solutions in a way that was set from the beginning, but you're always on the lookout for something like that.
That's incredible. So it's a win-win for nature and for the developer and for the ultimate investor in the property. And I've never known that, Mark, when I'm at, say, the sanctuary and I'm looking up the beach east, there's definitely a difference than when I look down the beach, the setbacks.
Like in Eugenia.
Exactly.
Eugenia, and it was a different era when the Royals laid out it, right? I mean, it was totally very different. There wasn't necessarily the pressure for all we knew, maybe those were going to be the only home sites on the entirety of Kiawah. So it was just a different thought process. But it is an example of the hope is professionally, you never stop learning because you can always observe and see the same thing differently over time. And it can be to the benefit of everyone.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that perspective. So we're back here with our inaugural edition of Lowcountry Legends. I'm with Frank Brumley and Mark Permar, and we're enjoying a fascinating conversation of the original or the more current era of Kiawah's development beginning in the 1970s. And before we pivot to the 2.0 period of 1987, 88, when the Charleston families and Frank came together as a new ownership group. Frank, I wanted to touch on a couple of things that came up in our earlier conversation. First, Rhett's Bluff. Mm-hmm. That almost was something very different than how we see it today.
It was. Charles had a vision basically for Rhett's Bluff to basically be a European waterfront village. And he sent Joe Frazier and Charles Frazier, Charles sent Joe and me and wives, Becky and Blanche, to the French Riviera and the Italian Riviera, but primarily the French Riviera, to look at the architecture and the mix of people and units and places and amenities and how it would all fall together for Rhett's Bluff. And at that point, it wasn't even known as Rhett's Bluff. It was going to be a Kiawah River with a major marina back there was the original idea too. And of course, I was gone from from 78 to 88. But in that period of time, the Tax Act of 1984 was passed, and basically they disallowed the deduction of second home interest deduction for second home interest payments. And that had been a big part of condominium sales, and it had to kind of build the whole financial picture for, well, I can buy the second home and I can rent it out and I can take deductions and I can deduct the interest, and that was no longer available. So it changed everything, and basically we had to redirect ourselves to a single family effort. And while I was gone, basically the ownership here did that, changed all of Rhett's Bluff from a waterfront resort European type village to a single family house development.
We had fun on the alternatives though while that was still being debated, Frank.
Right.
Because I remember doing a lot of studies with Ed Stone's office out of Florida and Sandy and Babcock out of San Francisco to extend that European village feel that you were remarking about, to have a Lock Harbor connection by cutting a channel between the river and Bass Pond and having a lock in there that would control the water elevation. And then Bass Pond was going to be reconfigured into one of those places that you visited called Port Grimaud in France, where it was all these fingers of high-density residential development in the European mode.
Right.
I mean, we had more fun doing studies internally. And then we would present those twice a year to the Kuwaiti board at the time. And those were always interesting. You might even want to reference that later on, but the board meetings that I attended lasted exactly 1 hour, twice a year with the Kuwaiti board, in which we presented studies like we're talking about. And about half that time was translation. So essentially you had 30 to 40 minutes to communicate the essence of whatever the next steps were. And every time we would present this even more and more expensive development philosophy of the high density development, they would get a little nervous about, I mean, they never registered it verbally, but you could see the body language was a little different until the Tax Act was the stumbling block. So I only offer that, Frank, in terms of what that transition was like.
I'm getting a little nervous thinking about Bass Pond being surrounded by high density.
Oh yeah,
development.
It was going to be
completely different.
That's incredible.
Something totally different. And the Beach Company group, and we came back in here in 1988. Everybody who came, because the Kuwait Investment Company were candidly not happy owners of Kiawah. It was the property owners out here weren't particularly happy. They weren't happy with their investment. And so it was kind of constantly, quietly on the market. Well, everybody that would come to Charleston to look at it would end up, Pat McKinney, who was our vice president of sales out here during the years when I was the original general manager, Pat left with me and became an investor in the development of Wild Dunes in the 79, 80 to 1984 when we sold our interest over there. But everybody would end up in Pat's office and my office. We had the Brumley McKinney Company, and we did a lot of investment development, shopping centers and apartments, and some residential, but not really a resort community development. We actually had Bluff under contract at one time, but did not pursue it because of the economy. But everybody that would end up in Charleston it's where the story came that I was quoted as saying, well, not only do we know where the skeletons are buried, but we still have the shovels. And so Pat and I would end up interviewing most everybody. Eventually, John Rivers came to me and said, Frank, we understand that Kuwaitis really do want to sell Kiawah. Would you join me and my brother-in-law, Bronson Ingram, from Tennessee, and we'd like to put an offer together to buy Kiawah. So we did that at a price of $100 million and put it under contract. And John's father died shortly thereafter, and he was a CBS affiliate here in Charleston. And basically, our proposal to buy Kiawah fell apart. And the next morning, the phone rang, and it was Charlie Way, the beach company, and said, Frank, I understand you're not pursuing with John Rivers, you and Pat, the purchase of Kiawah. Would you be interested in coming in with us and buying it and develop it? So we did. Pat and I joined the beach company, the Waylong Darby family as partners, and we jointly invested in it. I said, I'll do it, but I'm going to do it on a part-time basis because I've got the Brumley company now as a commercial real estate people. I've got dozen salesmen, things going on. I really don't want to give that up, but I would like to invest with you, and I'd like to be available on a part-time basis as a consultant. So I stayed on for that next 10-year period. Pat joined the company as president of the Kiawah Island real estate company and did a great job for them. And that's what led me into negotiations with the Guggenheim family to buy Daniel Island in 1997. And so that was kind of the transition. But the years that we spent from 88 to 97 were with the Waylong Darby family, and it was wonderful success. And that's kind of the formative years. Mark was there during that. Most of that, all of that period, and can speak to a lot of the details that went on. I was kind of split part-time between different things, but it was interesting. But one quick thing I've got to tell you, the early days at Kiawah were the most unbelievable. When Blanche and I moved here, I was 34, she was 33. We had our three little girls, 6, 8, and 10, had the house on Kiawah, and basically had the island to ourselves. I brought up an old 1945 Willis Jeep, an Army Jeep, and I had painted yellow, brought it up to Kiawah, and we had that on the weekends, had 2 big black labs and those 3 little girls, and not another soul really on the beach but those 10 or 15 houses. And we would spend every Saturday and Sunday in that Jeep, driving that beach. Blanche would sit them in a slough, and I'd fish. And so that's
incredible.
Most idyllic way to have gotten to know that island and to enjoyed it in those early years. And then to have watched it now for the last 50 years has really been remarkable. But back to the investment story, that the whole change in the tax structure of this economy changed with that. It became single family, high-end, very expensive marshfront lots. And it's really kind of set the tone for what's going on now. And the fact that Kiawah, I think annual sales last year topped $1 billion is just phenomenal.
Just for a 12-month period.
Yeah.
So it is fascinating, this conversation, the connection from Cumberland to St. Mary's to Amelia Island, Hilton Head Island, Kiawah, on up to Daniel Island. It's all interconnected with your story. Incredible. And there's another connection with Sea Island, Georgia, and the mark of Kiawah Island, what we all know of as the trademark Kiawah Island cursive. Tell us how that came to be.
Robert asked about this earlier, Mark, and I told him my memory of the situation. We were first putting the Kiawah story together when the Kuwait Investment Company owned it, and Diana and all of us were working for them and getting the marketing plan together. We needed a logo, and Charles had long worked with a lot of high-powered national consultants, and Ogilvy Mather was the real estate planning firm, design firm, particularly design firm, logo and that kind of work. So we went to them and said, basically, I told them, I said, I've got two favorite kind of script logos, and one of those is the Sea Island Company, and one of those is the Coca-Cola Company. And we really need to find something that we can use, and it's got legs it can carry forward. It has great reach back in memory for people for things that they remember growing up. And Sea Island, my mother and father lived there. My sister and brother did, both independently with their families. Blanche and I honeymooned there in 1962. St. Mary's was only 40 miles below Sea Islands. That's where we had grown up going, and it was kind of the epitome of what a particularly a southern resort oceanfront community ought to be. So it was interesting that we chose that as kind of the prototype for our logo and where the name and that flowing script came from.
I love that, and I feel there is a Sea Island, DNA also at Kiawah, so that's very fitting. So jumping ahead to the late 1980s now, the Beach Company and the buying group. Not long after that, we had a little windstorm that came through Kiawah. What was the name of that?
Hugo.
So Hugo comes through, and this is around the time that the ocean course is being developed and the Ryder Cup is being contemplated or is going to be hosted there. Can you guys speak a little bit to what that was like that time period, the storm and the ocean course's development?
Mark had started telling that story, and we were all in Birmingham, England. The Kiawah team was there, primarily the Beach Company folks, the Waylong Darby family, and Mark and myself and the planning team here were over there in preparation for the Ryder Cup that was going to be here on the new Pete Dye golf course in 1991. So we were there when the storm hit. And I remember because I had a good bit of independent real estate development work going on here in Charleston, and I was talking to my team every day. When I checked out, my hotel, because the telephone bill was run through the hotel front lobby, and my telephone bill was more than my hotel bill was. I spent more time on the telephone trying to figure out if Charleston was still on the map.
Right.
And we had a house at the Isle of Palms that got torched badly, and just literally 2/3 of it was demolished, and I sold it thereafter. I bought a place on Sullivan's, but I bought this place in 1990 also because I was so tired of
referencing where we are today here on Wadmalaw.
Here on Wadmalaw, the acreage that we have here on the North Edisto River, and I bought it because I was so tired of cleaning up Kiawah. The Kiawah was the last kind of lip of the storm as it went out, and we didn't have a lot of structural damage, but we had tremendous tree damage, and we ended up spending about $9 million, and part of that we funded, part of it was funded by the POA, and then we had the resort operation that was also involved in it, but we had a big, massive cleanup and had a lot of trees removed and burned, and so I was so tired of doing that. And this property, 500 acres that I've got here on Wadmalaw, just missed the edge of the storm. And I had about less than 1% tree damage here. So it was one of the reasons that we did that and bought and redid a place on Sullivan's. But the whole effort with the Ryder Cup and Jerry Barton. Jerry Barton was a guy from California. Leonard and Buddy and Mark and I went to the West Coast on the trip. Mark, we were there together at Pebble Beach.
Right.
We were looking for a buyer for the resort. We were smart enough to know when we bought Kiawah for $105 million in 1988. That was the largest, that was the record-setting largest real estate transaction in the history of South Carolina. And we bought it, and National Bank, NCNB, actually financed it for us. And Charlie Way would call me every morning and say, Frank, do you realize the interest today is $21,000? What the hell are you and Pat McKinney? Are you out selling something? But what's going on? So we had to make things happen. Mark had to get product ready for us, and that brought the first the Surf Song road property. The story, as I remember it, Mark, we infrastructure was to a point. The Kuwait Investment Company had not spent a lot of money on it, but things were still well maintained, and it was the people were not terribly happy, the property owners, with it, but it was well maintained and looked good. So we inherited something that was very developable. We had about $2 million to spend in infrastructure to be able to sell the next big chunk of oceanfront, which we sold, as I remember.
Osprey Beach.
Osprey Beach, about $75 million worth of property. We had to spend $2 million on to get it ready, and we sold it. And so we basically paid down a lot of our debt, and then we sold the resort to Jerry Barton, who was from California and from Oklahoma originally, and he paid us $35 million for the resort. So we recouped our $105 million purchase price pretty quickly, and then very shortly paid off the rest of the debt. So it was one of the great investments. It turned out to be. The timing was right. We had great years from early '90s and the changes, but we were at a good time with a good piece of property. Charleston was just beginning to hit its stride, and things went very well.
What were y'all selling lots on Osprey for in that initial slug?
Pat, I think I asked him that question, Mark. I think he told me $550 for an oceanfront.
I was going to say it wasn't much above $600,000 at that time, and that decision, which was precipitated by the fairly steep purchase price of selling off the resort, was a very interesting business decision, Frank. I mean, aside from the financials of it, Kiawah to that point was one company did everything.
Right.
One company did all the residential development, the resort facility or recreation development, operated all of those. It was unilateral. It was unilateral. One central marketing. And to go from that to essentially bilateral by finding a willing partner with the idea of shared responsibility, like the goal would be shared marketing, a variety of other things, but it was two companies that went off into the future together as opposed to one. I mean, that's a big adjustment to development patterns in terms of focus and everything. And it's where we are right now in terms of two companies that are principally
primarily we figured out we didn't want to be in the resort business.
Yeah.
We didn't know any damn thing about making beds and flipping hamburgers, and we were real estate people. We were dirt salesmen. So we wanted to get out of that business, so we started that marketing exercise to find, and we interviewed a lot of different people. And this great trip that Mark and I and Pat and Leonard Long and Buddy Darby went to California, and we looked at Pebble Beach, and and I haven't thought about this in a long time, so some of the names might escape me. Mark, help me out. But we spent time at Carmel and other resorts that we had looked at, but in particular that we struck this guy Jerry Barton, who had bought a number of, including Palm Beach Polo in Palm Beach, Florida, and he had acquired a savings and loan association, and he had basically ridden that up into a financing vehicle, and he was acquiring real estate tremendously. Ended up finally crashing and burning, and that brought in Bill Goodwin in the sanctuary.
So how long did was Jerry Barton involved?
Well, the Ryder Cup in '91 was a key milestone.
He brought the Ryder Cup,
right? Because they were the preeminent golf course developer at that time. Remember, they had an unusual number of golf pros that they sponsored.
That's right.
All of their facilities were very male golf oriented facilities. And because the Ryder Cup was originally to be out west.
It was to be out west, and they basically were responsible for brought it here. He had a guy that worked for him who was on the PGA board, and they had Pete Dye in their back pocket. And basically that was one of the reasons it sold us on the whole thing. He said, if you sell me the Kiawah Resort, I will bring the Ryder Cup here in '91.
And the platform for the ocean course.
That's right.
That was 3 miles of beachfront that was sold to them, of which about a mile or slightly less could be residential development. That was a big leap.
That was pretty unprecedented.
Oh, yeah.
And so the ocean course that we know today, which is, of course, a world-famous destination for golf on any golfer's bucket list, that was part of that transaction from your group, Frank, to sell to Jerry Barton and make that possible.
Right.
That's right.
And so you were telling Mark a moment ago a story when y'all were surveying Kiawah after Hugo by helicopter because you really couldn't even drive around on the island, and you saw something pretty remarkable at the ocean course site.
So the group that Frank was just talking about that were over in Birmingham, England for the '89 tournament finally made it back after Hurricane Hugo passed through. And this isn't a very good story with my wife because she was here and had to suffer through all of the hurricanes. So we won't bring it up with her.
Okay.
But when we got back, in addition to you looking at all your individual homes, they needed to see what's the condition of Kiawah. And as Frank pointed out, Kiawah didn't have the high water that the peninsula and north of the peninsula had, but it had the same winds. So the down material was excessive. You could not drive all the way from the front gate down island. You had to piecemeal it, and you certainly couldn't get to the ocean course, which had just started construction at the time. And so we hired a helicopter and we picked it up. We went to Charleston Executive Airport on Johns Island, got in the helicopter and started from the west and moved east. And the further we moved east over the property, it got really quiet in the helicopter because it kept getting worse and worse. And we finally get to where the ocean course is under construction. Pete Dye is on a bulldozer building the ocean course. He was oblivious to the storm. So
he had obviously stayed on island during the storm.
I have no idea, but I don't think so. I think he found his way.
He got there.
Got on a bulldozer with his team and took that bulldozer down the beach to the ocean course and said, I have a mission. I'm supposed to have a golf course ready for the '91 course.
Incredible.
And it did add some humor to what we had seen from the air.
We needed some humor too.
Right.
And can you believe it today, the success of that tournament? And it really set Kiawah as a golf, of course it's known for many things, but as a golf destination.
Would you say that?
War by the shore.
The last putt on that tournament launched the Ryder Cup alone to a significant level, much less the ocean course. And if you look at the pattern of the PGA championships that have now been platformed there, each one of them has a story too. So for as young as Kiawah is, it has the beginnings of an incredible history of golf, largely attributed to the ocean course, but in other venues too. I mean, the array of golf courses is considerable. But this historic reference of activity, I mean, people remember when they were at the Ryder Cup, right, Frank? I mean, they remember when that happened. And I think that a lot of people weren't necessarily here, but they remember it as if they were here.
Yeah, right, of course. Everyone was there, right?
Yeah.
Everyone was there.
It's all the putt.
Right.
So Mark, you and Diana still live on Kiawah today. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is remarkable. You have to be the longest continuous residence on Kiawah. as we sit here? I don't know how anyone could beat
I don't
you.
know.
I would think so.
Maybe. We're on the short list.
I think it's terrific. So, from a natural point of view, when you think about Kiawah, the bird life, the fauna, the shells on the beach, I mean, has it changed a lot, a little? I mean, how would you describe that?
Well, it's similar but different. Your perspective is different. You know, it's like going back to a familiar place. There's much about it that's familiar, but there's some that's different, partially because you're in a different place.
Okay.
So we went there as a young family, just like Frank and Blanche. We went there as a young family with a 2-year-old. Now she's 48 years old. And it was her hometown, essentially. She grew up on Kiawah. I must say that for Diana and I professionally, it was a combination of, essentially it's a 10,000 acre studio that you happen to be living in, but you're working there at the same time. It's a luxury that few professionals have, which is to be present. So, you know, the amount of time that either one of my wife or I would spend outside, we're also working at the same time by observation. You know, Diana's observing, I'm observing. And so to witness the evolution of the creation of a new community, much less a community within an environmentally sensitive area, it's a luxury that few people have. But you know, we've enjoyed it. It's still it is our hometown. It's our daughter's hometown, but it's our hometown too because we've lived there since '79. You are in an environment that I say this in a positive way. All I see are the mistakes I made. But I see those in a way of lessons learned. And something that made sense during an early period may not make as much sense now. And that's why the evolution of a community is, I think, the highest form of creativity. Because it goes from a starting point, like Frank and his team, meeting around a table in a single location, in which Frank, as he described, can assemble everyone that can help make a decision in that room. And within a short period of time, you make the decision and you go out and do it. And then you live it. Well, now we have, I think, approximately 4,700 properties that have been sold to date over the life of Kiawah. And for every one of those, there are at least 2-point-something property owners related to that, much less the resort guests that come and power up and power down during the season. Living in a community that is largely influenced by second home, you know, I think a little more than 70% of the property owners are non-residents, so they treat it like I don't want to say a second home, like another home. Their relationship is different than a primary home community. So to witness that and see how it evolves over time, and will now continue, you know, healthy communities never are static. Now, no matter how wonderful a community is, if it's frozen at that point, it won't evolve over time. And to date, I think Kiawah has done an excellent job of a combination of, you know, completing the first stage of development throughout. We're largely there now, except for property held by the resort, which they own considerable property that has yet to be developed. The primary developer is at the latter stages of that. So the pressures now in terms of observing are, how do you go from a single small group of professionals who make decisions for the thousands of acres to now thousands of property owners, each of which can have a way of influencing the decision of going forward of their property, of renovating their property, or reconsidering what their property is all about. Those transitions are interesting to witness.
As part of an incorporated town.
In an incorporated town now, we have town government as opposed to the unincorporated area. We have a homeowners association that now is not controlled by the early years. It's controlled on the board of directors by the developer, the community developer. Well, now that's controlled by property owners. They elect that body. So you have two nonprofit entities, the town of Kiawah Island, which is healthy financially, and you have the Kiawah Island Homeowners Association, which is financially healthy. But both of those are representing property owner bases. The town members are elected by voting members, so these tend to be the primary home owners. And the Homeowners Association is dominated by property owners that are not, full-time residents. And so that chemistry amongst all those,
or lack of it.
Or lack of it, yeah. There are hiccups. I'll say lowercase hiccups. But you still have two functioning for-profit companies, too. You have the original developer. Even though they might be at the tail end of original sales, they have a private club that they initiated in 1992 or 3 with the Beach Club.
Yeah.
That was a big business decision. The Kuwaitis didn't want to be in the private club business, but the Charleston families and Pat and Frank, that was one of the business decisions they made early on is to for the first time have a private club.
The first Robert A.M. Stern building
First
on the island.
Elevated the role of design considerably, and then the resort. And they have both existing operating functions, as you know, with the Sanctuary Hotel and the 4 golf courses, a major tennis facility. But they have a site of the original inn that they have been assessing for multiple years now of how to replace that. What should happen in that location?
How big is that site?
It's about 10 acres.
10 acres.
But they have entitlements for up to 150 rooms, like the original inn, Frank. Mm-hmm. And they've been going through multiple iterations of that. So when in advance of that, they build a new golf pro shop, clubhouse operation, a villa rental check-in, and a conference facility. Those 3 buildings beautiful. Were the first, you witnessed those. And the last piece to the puzzle is the core area there. And everyone's looking forward to that. It'll complete their study. But that's an example of redevelopment.
Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. And also, of course, they have the big parcel just west of the sanctuary.
Right.
And I like to tell people, if you want to understand what Kiawah must have looked like to your eyes, that's probably the last example. Is that parcel, right?
That's right. That windswept vegetation, the salt-pruned oaks in that location between the last windswept building and the Sanctuary Hotel is the entire run was like that. Mm-hmm. But you're right. But for example, the resort in that location have entitlements for up to another 175 rooms if they want to attach it to the Sanctuary Hotel, and all the public spaces were sized for that. Or they may reconsider alternative uses in that area.
Wow. A lot still to come on the Kiawah story.
Right.
One of my favorite design details is hiking, if you will, in the preserve, in the series of trails and the towers and the bird life observable, the marsh. That is a fascinating story in its own right. The marsh towers. Whose idea was that? Was that one of you guys?
The team.
Yeah.
Team of professionals. That was one of the earliest things in the 2.0 version that Frank and Buddy and Leonard and Charlie Way and Pat all decided to develop that. This is post Hugo.
Yeah.
So the idea of rethinking the relationship to the natural framework, it took an even more important role in the preserve. So what you see was a device which is simple, which is trails and platforms and towers and so forth to connect people to the natural environment, get them out of their homes.
Yeah,
in a sense.
I think a lot of people don't know that those trails exist.
Right.
Because when I hike them, which is frequently, I'm usually I don't see many others, but they are. It's remarkable that exists in the vision that went into making that happen on an island that is becoming as densely developed as Kiawah is.
Well, the hope is that no matter where you are, even though you have a sense of the relationship to homes, that ultimately the fabric of the natural system is still the lead story. In the preserve, it's even more so. It's even more exaggerated, to your point. But there are different devices for how to integrate the built environment with the natural environment.
Nice.
I've got a funny story about the Jeep safaris. That was one of the most popular things that we ever did at the island. It was just people flocked there. A lot of people came there for vacations, kind of because they wanted to see the alligators and see the deer and everything. Well, when we bought the island back in '88 with the beach company crowd, we were out working through one of the abandoned fields, and we came across not a Jeep, but 4 of the trailers that were used to be pulled on the Jeep safaris. The trailers were all grown up with weeds and rusted and in terrible shape. Well, I had the idea to put those on a trailer and brought them here to Wadmalaw, and I still have them. And we pull them behind.
Oh my God!
We pull them behind my Jeep. So I've got
you
two
still
of those.
got the Kiawah trailers.
2 of those 50-year-old Jeep Safari trailers. They've been probably got an inch of paint on them now and 2 inches of rust.
That's incredible.
Do you still put your safari hats on?
No, I should. But a gal, Betty Poor, who's on the front of that book sitting up in the Jeep. She was probably in her 20s at the time and went on to be a very successful real estate salesperson here, still selling for Dunes properties.
Cool.
And her mother was a storied real estate person, but Betty that was one of her first jobs out of college. She drove a Jeep and pointed out alligators, and she's still,
and that's Rob Hall on that cover too.
Oh, is it? I didn't realize that.
The original on-site planner.
I'll have to tell you another quick funny story about telling. I guess maybe Mark and I were talking the other day, but we were building the first golf course. We had problems. There were feral hogs on the island that were left over from the original owners, and they would, every time we'd plant a green, the hogs would find it overnight, and of course they would root them up terribly. So we decided, well, we've got to get rid of the hogs, and so we had a big strategic session up at Orange Hill about how we were going to get rid of the hogs, and the best solution to it was to trap them. So we got a bunch of hog traps, wood frame traps, and we'd bait them. And every morning we'd come in on Monday mornings, and the score would be, how many hogs did you catch? And so it ended up being, the score is Kiawah 0 and hogs 35. So the hogs, we couldn't catch them. So we were out there and decided that we needed some way to bait the traps. So I had a fellow who still lives nearby, MC Haywood, was the first original Johns Island native who worked for the Kiawah Island Company, and he went on to lead our bellhop crowd. Was here forever, still around, still here. I don't think he still works on the island, but so I had MC. I said, MC, I've got this idea. Let's see what you can figure out. And didn't talk to him about it anymore, but we figured out some way to try to catch the hogs. Well, so Blanche and I and the girls, and I always carried a rifle in the Jeep with me. We were out riding and came by the traps, and I could see this was off, maybe 40 yards off in the bushes, and there stood a hog inside of the trap. The door hadn't dropped, and there were 2 stalled hogs standing outside. So big, good-sized boar and a sow, I think. So I lifted up my rifle and shot and killed both hogs. And so I got MC on the phone, and I said, MC, I've just killed 2 hogs over at the traps on Kiawah. You come get them and butcher them and have a barbecue at your house for the people on Johns Island. It was this pregnant pause on the other end of the phone. He said, "Mr. Brumley," he said, "you done shot the wrong hogs." And I said, "MC, what are you possibly talking about? Well, there are no wrong hogs. We've got all these wild hogs on the island." He said, "No, those were 2 tame hogs that we borrowed from a farmer, and they were tied inside the
Those
trap.
were the bait.
Those were the bait. Those were the bait hogs." So I killed the bait, and so I caught a lot of grief about that for a long time. When I told you I came over to speak to the Mark, and I spoke to the Kiawah Property Owner Association 15 years ago. They wanted to hear, and so I told them the hog story.
Oh my gosh!
Took the blame for killing the bait in the trap, and got the biggest laugh. The biggest laugh of the evening came from those guys.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness!
A lot of wonderful stories and a lot of good times.
The early years of pioneering spirit, that everyone was in on the creation of this. When I say everyone, it wasn't just the community developer. It wasn't everyone. I would suggest early property owners. The nature of conversations in comparison to today. You asked a little leading question about how is it different now? I will say that, and maybe I'm romanticizing it, Frank, but you could have a conflict with a property owner on a topic.
Oh, yeah.
But how it was presented, how it was discussed was, could this be better? Or could we collaborate on this? Or I don't know if I'm making sense here. But
there was
and I think it all grew out of a pioneering spirit,
Pioneer spirit.
That you're part of an early stage of something, and people tend to be more tolerant of conditions or situations or whatever, as opposed to a settled place.
Mm-hmm.
No. That's different. And I don't mean it's just a sign of the times. I think it's the evolution of community.
Mm-hmm.
And much can be gained by tapping a pioneering spirit within yourself about how you present a concern or how you might react to pitching in or that sort of thing when it comes to, for example, and let me give you a really good example. The pace of development within a subdivision is much longer and slower in an environment like Kiawah in general when compared to a primary home neighbor like Daniel Island. There's a lot of activity within a 2 to 3 year period in a neighborhood because there's all this construction activity, and then that neighborhood is complete, largely complete. We still have home sites in initial releases at the West Beach area in areas, home sites that still haven't been built.
Eugenia Avenue.
Been passed down, down through families.
So when imagine now, you go into those neighborhoods and you build your home, and then you're used to a lot next to you or across the street not being built on for as long as you've been there. And then one day you wake up and see surveying crews out there, and you start to get anxious, and that energy that starts to kick in of, well, I didn't think that was really going to happen or whatever.
Thought that was part of the park.
We thought that was part of a park. My point being is the nature of the evolution of a community is not a right-wrong thing as it relates to Kiawah. It's different than what people are familiar with, maybe from where they grew up or where their hometown was and when they come to this place. Because you tend to get used to the context of partial development, partial undevelopment in areas. And that's where the friction's too strong a word, but that's where the anxiety starts to build.
Good.
Which is, intellectually, I always agree with personal property rights and so forth, but I didn't think that lot was going to be built on.
It's called blow up the bridge syndrome, and I found it in every community I've developed over the last 50 years. That's what happens and I'm going through it right now at Daniel Island. People that basically didn't think things were going to happen. In the early days at Kiawah, Blanche and I and the girls on weekends, typically Saturday and Sunday, we were out there and we were living downtown. We'd go to the inn at night for dinner, Jasmine Porch. Well, the entire dinner was one constant, healthy, fun interruption from property owners and or their guests or somebody who had family in for the weekend coming by the table and interrupting supper and wanting to talk about things. And Mark said it was a real esprit de corps. It was a camaraderie that went on that was really, really healthy. In the later years of the property, it's this blow up the bridge thing, that I have too long a wait to get a tea time or a restaurant a reservation and too damn many people here, and that goes on. At Daniel Island, we bought it in 1997. There was not a single resident on the island when we bought it from the Guggenheim family. Today we have 16,000 people living on the island. It's 94% built out, but it's been wonderful. But I used to know every road. Now I can't remember the names of the streets. It's fully developed. But it's the great part of being in the real estate development business. You see the fruits of your labors. So many times if you're a lawyer and you're drafting a will or crafting a divorce for somebody, it's not something that you really can see and touch and feel and be a part of, be proud of. In the real estate business, it's something, I used to say it's kind of like Christmas every morning. You never know what the next telephone call or the next letter you open, what it's going to bring. But in the business, for me to ride through Kiawah today or Daniel Island or go back down to Amelia, it's a tremendous amount of self-satisfaction to be able to see what you were a part of. And I know Mark feels that way from having, put it on paper and then seeing it happen.
Make a difference in people's lives in ways that you'd never imagine. I mean, most of the work I do on teams is about something in the mid or distant future. And one reason why I tend to serve on ARBs is it's healthy for me to witness what's more immediate because I can stay in that world of the future forever. It's fun to imagine and visualize what a team can accomplish. But the sharp reality is, creating community, like we were saying earlier, it really is the highest form of creativity because everyone participates in it in one way or the other. Even if they don't think they're participating, they are participating. And real communities continue. Kiawah is 50 years from the start of it next April.
50 years to when Frank ran into Miss Eugenia on the bridge.
Well, more than 50.
74, be 51
74. Yeah.
Right.
So we're coming up on 76, which is the first time people as a whole could come onto Kiawah, right?
Yep.
But we're, 25 miles away from a 350-year-old community of Charleston.
That's right.
It is continuing to reinvent itself. Is continuing to look for ways to become or maintain relevancy in the world. I mean, those two extremes, which by American standards are extremes, by European standards, they're hardly anything.
Right.
But by American standards, you have two examples of creating community and all the challenges associated with them. But like you said, Frank, I wouldn't trade it for anything else in the world.
It's really interesting. Pat McKinney had an interesting way of capturing the whole marketing and sales and trust me, this is what we're going to do. He laughed about it. He said the great thing about living through it and getting to a point, Frank, where you are at Kiawah and at Daniel Island, it's called making your lies come true. I thought it's a very interesting observation from a marketing guy.
Yeah.
Well, as we start to close our conversation, I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions and ask you to try to give me just like one word or really bullet point responses. This is all spontaneous. Let's see what happens with this. Frank, I'll start with you. What are you most proud of when you think back to Kiawah Island and how it's developed today?
Well, I think to ride through there, and it's one of the great things about being involved in these different communities. One of the things, the last thing as you sell or as you walk away, you extract a club membership for life. And so I've got club memberships at Kiawah and Wild Dunes and Daniel Island and Yeamans Hall and a lot of different places like that. So I get to go back.
Yeah.
And so I go back to Kiawah maybe once a year.
Yeah.
And not a lot more often, but to ride through and see. And there's some things that are mixed emotions. I ride down and see where the Kiawah Island Inn and the Jasmine Porch no longer exists. It's an empty hole there now.
Yep.
It kind of tugs at your heart. You remember what was there and how you built and how you got it rezoned. But it'll be just as fun. I'm 84. Maybe in 5 years from now, I'll arrive and there'll be a new hotel.
Yeah.
But Bill Goodwin's almost as old as I am. I don't know if he's going to have a chance to get that done or not. But I think that that's really the key to it, is to be able to ride and look and see what's progressed. And 95% of it are things you're proud of.
Nice. That's a high percentage. Mark, how would you answer that question?
You should have campaign ribbons like the military, Frank, and you should wear them. I think the thing I'm most proud of is that when you drive through, walk through, bike through Kiawah, that the natural environment is still the lead, that it's still present in substantive ways. Yes, it's different than that first Jeep ride that I mentioned earlier on, but fundamentally, the fabric, the framework, is still there. And it would have been disappointing if it had big gashes in it. And yeah, there's focus on that occasionally in terms of new construction or tear down a house and suddenly there's a void there and so forth. But in the end, when the built world is like this with the natural environment and not like this, where the natural environment and the built world are separate, but they coexist. I think Kiawah, in the end, it feels to me that it's still woven.
It does.
And
nice.
It's worn well.
And that is, to be honest with you, that's not easy.
No.
Because it's a challenge literally every day by everyone involved in that. Because it's easy to violate that.
You gentlemen are both visionaries in real estate and development. Where do you see Kiawah in 10 to 20 years? What challenges? And if you're a vested interest holder in Kiawah, resident, property owner, what should you be doing to influence those things? Sorry, 3 questions in one, but how would you respond to that, Frank?
You know, I think Charles Frazier candidly did it for us. And you'll find this hard to believe, but Charles was a Yale lawyer who really came up with the original concept of restrictive deed covenants about what you could do with a piece of property when you bought it. And just because you owned it, you didn't get to select the house color or which trees you got to take down. And believe it or not, his original documents from the 60s at Hilton Head Island have been massaged and manipulated and improved and just generationally by lawyers. But so many documents I can see in new communities today, and Mark as a planner can speak to this, but you'll find the original sea pines deed restrictions that Charles Frazier formed from his Yale training in place. And that's why Kiawah, and I used them again at Daniel Island, but you get them, you tweak them, you get them a little better each time, and because of that, there is a continuity and a permanence that's built into those communities. So I think that you'll find Kiawah 10 years from now, 20 years from now, still looking very much like it looks today, and a lot of it is that restrictive deed structure, covenants, restrictions that can't be changed. And the current property owners and the POAs, the property owner associations, are adamant, and they'll wave them in your face. I mean, I can tell you they see them as their control over their space not being violated. And so they're as fierce protectors of those restricted deed covenants as the developers are, which is great. That's why they bought. I mean, you can't put most new home communities, you can't put a for sale sign in your yard, and it's because of that deed restriction they put in there, because they didn't want to ride through a place and seeing a bunch of for sale signs, different colors, different places scattered all around the neighborhoods. So most of them, and that came from an original Charles Frazier deed restriction covenant.
Wow. Mark, how would you tackle that one?
Well, I'm not certain I can better what Frank just shared with you. I will say this, that the leader, the original developer and subsequent developers have tried in their own unique ways to lead by example, by choices made. And the physical part of that is the more obvious thing, because everyone can look at it and make their own determination. But each of those was a product of doing homework, which included an understanding of history, and not accepting all of it, but understanding it and understanding what worked and what hasn't worked, and offer judgment. And having standards in place is extremely important, because that is something it tends to be black and white. People can read that, and usually interpretation of wording can't be too far astray in terms of, like you were talking about, Frank, in terms of the standards that Charles initiated and then continued to be refined. But ultimately, sometimes just judgment of how you apply those is the ultimate test. And the hope would be that as property owners change out over time and play different roles, some more involved in decision-making than others, at least try pretty hard to understand the history of the evolution of Kiawah, not unlike what you're trying to do with various episodes of the thing that we're doing today. It's building a history that you can listen to and accept or reject, but you can't. But it's history. Its history is voiced by people like Frank and I. There's a lot to be learned from that, but ultimately it's judgment of decision makers at key moments. Every community has, and Joe Riley that you mentioned earlier on was probably is the most relevant example of being a leader in exercising, along with others, judgment at really key moments of the evolution of the modern day era of Charleston. So what is the equivalent of that going forward? That's you didn't ask the question, but that's a challenge of how do you maintain the values that originated in the 70s that we still live with today. And designing with nature is a principle. It's a way of thinking about how you approach decisions that permeate a lot of choices that people make. Styles can come and go. Popular things can come and go. But the core of Kiawah really goes back to the beginning, which is that designing with nature attitude, that you do your homework, you learn from it, you make choices, you don't stop learning, you keep evaluating, not unlike the questions you're asking, like what do you think about now versus you just, I wish there was a requirement of property owner purchase. I know we can't do this, but required some element of listening or reading or something that exposed people to the history that led to the choices that were made, that were built the way they were or operated the way they were or whatever. Because sometimes you can actually learn something there that would result in a better outcome from your own choice. So if you're coming to make a choice of buying an existing home and you want to reinvent it, there's some things you could learn from the past that would help with that. Or if you're buying a home site, or what's happening more often now, buying a home and tearing it down and rebuilding. So I can't better what Frank said, though. That's the bottom line.
I'll have to say a quick Joe Riley story. When we cut the ribbon for the inn at Kiawah in 1976, I had to put together somebody to cut the ribbon. And Joe, of course, downtown Charleston, had nothing to do with Kiawah at all. And but I was trying to find two of the higher profile, well-known people in the community. And so I got Fritz Hollings, and who was our current U.S. Senator at the time, and Joe Riley to come out and cut the ribbon, opening the Kiawah Island Inn. And they did, and I've got a great picture of it. We all look considerably different than we do now.
I saw Joe this morning when I was coming down here, leaving downtown.
Great guy and a great friend. So when we bought Daniel Island, like my brother came over from Atlanta, and we went to Joe's office to tell him that we bought Daniel Island. And so Joe said, well, Frank, it's come a long way from 1976 when we cut the ribbon at the end. And he said, well, tell me about your plan. What are you going to do? And I said, well, I really need to come sit down and talk to you about it, because I've long heard you say that some of your ideas of how you want, because had been annexed into the city of Charleston, Daniel Island had, and I knew Joe, we were going to have to write our own zoning code, which we did, and he collaborated with us on it. Joe was a frustrated architect, land planner, and a great one with great sense of taste, but he ended up picking brick for most of my projects going forward, how much of a detail that he wanted. But he said, come in and let's have a planning session. Come in and talk to you. So I did one day by myself, just Joe and I sitting there, and I said, Joe, I've long heard you say, because I'd heard him espouse this publicly, that he wanted to see public golf on Daniel Island. And I said, Joe, you brought this up, and I just want to tell you that's not going to be possible. And he said, we were just in the very early planning stages. We had a group called Cooper Robertson from New York. Jack Robertson was doing our master plan. He was president of the landscape architecture department, School of Architecture at UVA. Really, really super nice, very talented guy, good friend of Joe Riley's through the Urban Land Institute. And so we were putting that master plan together, and Joe said, Frank, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I've got to have private golf. I can't compete with the Wild Dunes and the Kiawahs and other places in the community and sell expensive real estate property, lots, and have it on a public golf course. And I understand public golf, and I appreciate it, and I'm not a golfer, but I can tell you I understand this end of it. I've got to have private golf. And it's dead silence. And Joe sat there and looked for a few minutes, and he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. He said, I hope you don't have to have a gate. And I said, no. I said, I've built gated communities in the resort business, including Wild Dunes and Kiawah and Amelia Island. But I really would like to have an open, inclusive community at Daniel Island and not have a gated community. I think it'll be a lot healthier. It'll be it's going to be a primary home community. It's not going to be a resort. We're going to have a couple of great golf courses. And typical Joe, he looked me right in the face, stuck his hand across the table, and said, we got a deal. He said, you don't do a gate, and I'll give you private golf. He said, I want people to be able to drive through the golf course in their cars with their families and see it and participate in it, look at it, but they'll have to pay to join your club if you want private golf. And I said, you got a deal. And it has worked over the last almost 5 years. It has worked perfectly. It's never been an inhibitor for us to not have a gated community, and that's what pretty well a lot of people in expensive community from Briars Creek to Wild Dunes, that's what they expect. They expect a private gated community, and they think it's safer, but in reality, it's not.
Yeah, I can't imagine Daniel Island with a gate.
Yeah. It's never been a problem.
If we could ask you this question.
No, that's not part of the deal.
No, it's part of the deal. Why did you and your family choose Kiawah and continue to choose it?
Well, so the nature, the connection to nature. I mean, the green and the beach, the low rise, and we had three. Our boys were infants when we bought our first condo in Mariner's Watch, $89,000. one bedroom, Kiawah. And that was, it just felt like going to the country. It felt like that was our country place, was Kiawah, to go spend the weekends and be in the, connected to nature, as you said earlier. So you
evolved your relationship from that kind of relationship to a more permanent relationship.
Yeah, and I really want to say on behalf of all the property owners at Kiawah, thank you to you two gentlemen and your wife Diana, who we've referenced several times today, for your critical inputs to making Kiawah what it is today. And we now know, I hope any listener today understands that what we enjoy and appreciate about Kiawah today was not accidental. It was very purposeful. It was very thoughtful. It was very deliberate. And in some cases, it was unorthodox. It went against conventional wisdom. It went against the grain. And it resulted in things that some might take for granted today. None of it was accidental. And I certainly have gained that from today's conversation. And I think that's something any listener hopefully will take away. So I would like to say this, Frank, Mark, sincerely, thank you for your contributions to our community, to Kiawah, and for sharing your memories and your insights with us today. And I'd also like to thank anyone who's tuned in for our inaugural Lowcountry Legends podcast. Hopefully, we'll do this again.